All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is the loop you don't know you're in. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first the overview itself, the loop, the illusion, the fear, the exit, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. We work with entrepreneurs, creators, professionals, and high performers in all sorts of fields to basically help them master every aspect of their life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, with one complete system. So if you're interested in that, again, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you want this training along with this document, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters on how to improve in every aspect of your life, then make sure to join the free newsletter from the link in the description. With that said, let's get started and talk about the loop. So there's something you've probably been doing every single day for years, and you know it's a problem, and you've tried to stop, and you most likely couldn't. You've tried screen time limits, you've tried grayscale mode, you've tried deleting the apps and reinstalling them a week later. You've told yourself 100 times that tonight would be different, that you'd put the phone down after 10 minutes, that you'd read instead, and it never stuck. And what I need you to understand is that it wasn't a failure of willpower. Every single attempt you made to cut back was a failure of method. You were trying to resist something you still believed was giving you something, and that's a fight that nobody wins. Now, there's a different approach. It doesn't ask you to resist. It doesn't give you rules or limits or clever hacks. It shows you something about the habit itself that you've never seen clearly before. Something you probably already suspect on some level, but nobody has ever laid out for you plainly. And once you see it, the desire to scroll just goes away. The want itself disappears. And that's exactly what this training is going to do. There's one sentence, one line that makes the entire illusion collapse. You know it's true before you can even argue with it. And after that, stopping becomes the easiest thing in the world. And by the end, you're going to understand exactly how the loop works, what scrolling actually gives you, and the answer will surprise you, and why every fear you have about stopping is the trap itself talking. Once those three things click, the exit is already open and you won't have to do anything to really stop doom scrolling. So something probably happened today, right? Or yesterday, or honestly every single day for the last few years. And it's so normal now that you barely even register it. You sat down somewhere, maybe on the couch, maybe in bed, maybe at your desk during a break, and you picked up your phone. And there wasn't a notification you needed to check. There wasn't really a message you were waiting for. You just picked it up for some reason. And then 30 minutes later, maybe an hour, you put it down and you felt a kind of hollow, kind of drained feeling. Like you just lost time that you can't get back and you're not even sure what you saw. That right there is the exact loop we're talking about. And until you understand how it actually looks and how it works, you'll keep getting pulled back. Now, the way this whole thing operates is honestly so simple that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that simplicity is actually what makes it so effective at keeping you stuck, because your phone creates a feeling of low-level restlessness, this subtle sense that something might be happening somewhere, that there's something to check or see or to catch up on. And then it offers itself as the solution to that exact feeling. So you pick it up, you scroll a bit, and the restlessness fades for a moment. And then it comes right back stronger than before, which is how you end up scrolling for an hour when you only meant to check one thing. Now, that underlying tension you feel when you haven't looked at your phone in a while isn't natural, right? Think about it. And it's worth really understanding that, because most people assume it's just boredom or curiosity when actually it's a trained response that your phone put there over months and years of repetition. Now, every single time you reached for your phone in an idle moment, you reinforced the connection between nothing happening and check the phone. And now that connection fires automatically, almost like a reflex, without any conscious decision on your part. And the tricky part is you genuinely believe you want to scroll, right? That some part of you is choosing it, when in reality you're just responding to a discomfort that the phone itself created, which is the same mechanism behind basically every habit loop ever studied. Now, this happens dozens of times a day for most people, and each time it happens, the loop gets a little tighter, a little more automatic, a little harder to even notice it is happening. So when you pick up the phone and start scrolling, that restlessness goes away for a moment, and that brief relief is really what your brain registers as enjoyment, as satisfaction, even though you're not actually gaining anything from the content you're consuming. And the relief never lasts, right? It typically lasts for maybe 30 minutes, and then you're back at it again, which is honestly the most important thing to understand here. And the reason it never lasts is that the scrolling itself regenerates the restlessness. So you're stuck in a cycle where the cure keeps recreating the problem. And over time, you need more scrolling to just get the same amount of relief, which is why what used to be a 5-minute check has probably become a 30-minute one, or an hour-long session for most of you watching this. Now, what makes this loop so hard to break is that it's almost completely invisible while you're still inside it, right? And by the time you notice what's happening, you've already lost the time, already spent the attention, already drained the energy. And that invisibility is honestly the loop's greatest weapon. Everyone around you is doing the same thing, which makes it feel completely normal, completely harmless, just something people do. And that social normalcy is one of the strongest forces keeping the loop intact, because you never really question a behavior that literally everyone you know shares. So you look at other people scrolling on the train, in waiting rooms, at dinner, and it basically confirms that this is just what life looks like now, which makes it almost impossible to see it as a problem. Nobody talks about this as an addiction, and that silence gives it a kind of permission, a free pass that alcohol or cigarettes or drugs don't necessarily get, even though the mechanism is functionally the same. And then on top of that, most of your scrolling happens without any conscious decision at all. And that's actually the defining feature of the loop. The fact that you don't choose to enter it, you just find yourself already in it. Sometimes mid-scroll, before you even realize you picked up the phone. Now, there are specific moments that tend to pull you in, like transitional moments between tasks, or the first few seconds of boredom, or right when you wake up and right before you sleep. And once you start noticing these triggers, you'll see how mechanical and predictable the whole thing really is. After enough repetition, scrolling stops being something you do and really starts feeling like something you are, like someone who just needs their phone around. And that shift from behavior to identity is where the loop gets really entrenched. And that's exactly why the first step, the most important step, is really simply seeing the loop for what it is. Clearly and obviously without any judgment, because you genuinely cannot exit something you don't know you're in. And most people have been in this loop so long that they've completely forgotten there's an outside. Now, the moment you start recognizing the pattern in real time, catching yourself mid-reach, noticing the restlessness for what it actually is, everything starts to change slowly. And that change doesn't require any willpower or discipline or any special technique. It's just you seeing the loop that creates distance from it. And that distance is where your freedom lives, because the loop only works when you're fully inside it, when you're not noticing it, when you're fully identified with the urge, fully on autopilot. Now, the thing that people consistently underestimate is how much time this actually takes from them across a week or a month or a year. And when you add it up, even a conservative estimate puts most people at somewhere between 2 and 4 hours a day of pure scroll time, which across a year is literally over 1,000 hours. Can you imagine that? Those hours compound, and obviously in ways that you can't notice day to day, but they show up in the things that you never got around to. The projects that you maybe didn't start, the books you didn't read, the skills you didn't build. And when you zoom out, the cost becomes very real and very concrete. Every hour spent scrolling is an hour that could have gone towards something you actually care about. And the painful part is that you know this. You're right. You feel it. You've probably told yourself 100 times that you'll cut back. And it's not just the time either. Scrolling drains a specific kind of mental energy, the kind you need for focus and creativity and real engagement with your life, which is why you often feel tired after a long scroll session, even though you are technically doing absolutely nothing. Now, the drain happens so gradually that you don't even feel it as a single loss. You just slowly become someone with less time, less energy, less capacity for the things that actually matter to them. And you assume that's just how life is now. And the really difficult part, and I say this from experience, is that the damage accumulates so slowly that you don't feel it happening. And by the time you do notice, you've already lost months or years to something that gave you absolutely nothing in return. Now, most people, when they're honest with themselves, already know they scroll too much. They already feel some version of regret or frustration about it, and that feeling itself becomes another trigger for the loop, because guess what you do when you feel bad? You pick up the phone. So if you project the current pattern forward 5 years or 10 years, the amount of life that goes to the scroll is genuinely staggering, and that projection alone should be enough to make you want to understand how to get out. Now, none of this is accidental, by the way. The platforms that serve you this content have spent billions of dollars and employed thousands of engineers specifically to create and maintain this loop. And understanding that context matters as well, because it means you're not weak for getting caught on it. You're just up against a system that was designed from the ground up to keep you exactly where you are. The infinite scroll, the autoplay, the algorithmic feed that learns exactly what keeps your eyes on the screen, all of it was built with one goal in mind, and that goal is your attention. Measured in minutes, by the way, sold to advertisers and optimized relentlessly. These algorithms know you better than you know yourself in some ways, because they've tracked every pause, every like, every share, every moment you lingered on something for an extra second, and they use all of that data to serve you exactly the kind of content that keeps the loop going. And the reason this matters is that when you understand the loop was designed intentionally and strategically by people who profit from your attention, it becomes a lot easier to stop blaming yourself for falling into it, and a lot easier to decide you want out and to opt out. Now, your time and attention are literally the product being sold, which means the longer you scroll, the more money someone else makes. And the system will never tell you to stop, because stopping is against its financial interest. Now, your interests and the platform's interests are fundamentally misaligned. And once you really get that, once you understand that the app is trying to extract as much of your attention as possible, the whole experience starts to feel different. And knowing this doesn't automatically break the loop, but it does something crucial. It separates you from the loop. It makes you the person observing the trap rather than the person stuck in it. And that separation is where everything starts to change. And so the whole thing feeds on itself in a way that most people never fully grasp until someone lays out plainly. And here it is. The phone creates discomfort. The phone then relieves the discomfort. The relief creates more discomfort. You reach for the phone again, over and over and over, hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a week, until the loop feels so natural you mistake it for your own personality. Each scroll session doesn't just satisfy the urge, it strengthens it, which means every time you give in to the impulse, you're making the next impulse harder to resist. And that compounding effect is why people feel like the habit gets worse over time, even when they're trying to actually cut back. Each scroll session doesn't just satisfy the urge, right? It strengthens it. So the brain is doing exactly what it's designed to do here, reinforcing behavior that produces relief. And the tragedy is that the relief is manufactured by the same thing causing the discomfort in the first place. So the reinforcement is essentially training you to stay trapped. And this is why the loop speeds up over time rather than slowing down. The more you scroll, the more you need to scroll, and the faster the cycle turns, which is how something that started as a harmless 5-minute check 3 years ago has now become the dominant activity in your day. Now, the only way to break a self-reinforcing loop is really to see through it, and that's what the rest of this training is going to do. We're going to look at what you think scrolling gives you. We're going to look at what actually keeps you doing it, and by the end, you're going to understand something that changes everything, which is that there was never anything to give up in the first place. This is the same approach that's been used to help people break some of the most deeply ingrained habits on the planet. You don't fight the urge, you don't try to overpower it. You show the person clearly that the thing they're hooked on isn't actually giving them anything. And once they see that, the desire just disappears. No willpower required. We're doing exactly the same thing here with scrolling. We're removing the desire itself, which is the only thing that was ever keeping the loop alive. So let's talk about the illusion. Now, most people who scroll a lot know on some level that they're doing it too much, right? They feel the time loss, the drain, the low-grade guilt afterwards. But they keep doing it anyway. And the reason they keep doing it is that they genuinely believe scrolling gives them something. And maybe it's entertainment, maybe it's relaxation, maybe it's connection, a break from the stress of real life. Now that belief, that sense that you're getting something valuable from the scroll, is the single biggest thing keeping you stuck. So let's actually look at what scrolling gives you, honestly and carefully. The first thing that most people would say is that scrolling is entertaining, that the content is funny or interesting or engaging, and on the surface that seems obviously true. But if you actually pay attention to how you feel during and after a scroll session, the picture looks completely different. Try to remember what you watched the last time you scrolled for 30 minutes. Really try. Like, actually go back in time and try to remember what you watched. Now, most people can't recall more than one or two things, if even. And even those are vague, right? Because the content is designed to be consumed instantly and forgotten immediately, which is generally not how real entertainment works. The sheer amount of content you're exposed to in a single session means nothing really gets processed deeply. Nothing sticks. Nothing actually enriches your thinking or your mood or your understanding of anything. And that's a pretty strong sign that what you're experiencing isn't entertainment in any meaningful sense. Now, real entertainment, the kind that actually leaves you feeling good, requires some engagement from you, some investment, some interaction with the material. And scrolling is the opposite of that. It's pure passivity, which is why it leaves you feeling flat instead of fulfilled. And the worst part is that this fake version of entertainment starts to replace the real one. Because after enough scrolling, your attention span shrinks to the point where a book or a movie or even a long conversation starts to feel like too much effort. And so you default back to the scroll. Now imagine a life like that, right? Where you can't even look at art anymore. You can't read, you can't watch a movie, you can't even listen to music that is not constantly stimulating. And here's what makes this even clearer. The longer you scroll, the less enjoyable it gets. And everyone knows this from experience, that feeling of scrolling past 10, 20, 50 pieces of content and nothing is quote unquote hitting right. Nothing is satisfying. But you keep going anyway because stopping somehow feels harder than continuing. That experience of scrolling and looking for the one good video that will make the session feel worthwhile, that's not entertainment. That's searching. And the fact that you have to search so hard for satisfaction is proof that the satisfaction was never really there in the first place. So compare that to watching a movie you actually love, a film, or reading a book that grips you, or having a real conversation with someone who makes you laugh. Those things fill you up. Scrolling empties you out. The difference is obvious once you start noticing it. Now, the second thing people believe is that scrolling helps them maybe relax, that it's a way to unwind after a long day or decompress during a stressful moment. And this one is maybe the most dangerous illusion of all, because it feels so true while being so wrong. Scrolling is one of the most stimulating things you can do to your brain, and that's the exact opposite of relaxation. Every new video, every new image, every new piece of text is a micro hit of novelty that your brain has to process. And after hundreds of those in a row, your nervous system is more activated than it was before you started. There's good research showing that excessive phone use raises cortisol levels, which is your body's stress hormone. And that means the thing you're using to quote unquote relax is actually making you more stressed, more wired, more unable to genuinely calm down. And this is especially true at night when most people do their heaviest scrolling, right before bed at the exact time your body needs to be winding down. And instead, you're flooding it with blue light and rapid fire stimulation, which is why so many people have trouble falling asleep and wake up feeling unrested. Now, what scrolling actually does is numb you. And numbing feels like relaxation if you don't look too closely. But there's a massive difference between the two, obviously. Relaxation restores your energy. It should. That's what the whole idea of relaxation is. Numbing just suppresses your awareness of how drained you already are. And when the numbing wears off, all that fatigue and stress is still right there, sometimes worse than before. A lot of the time, scrolling is really just avoidance dressed up as leisure. A way to not think about the thing that's actually bothering you. And the problem with avoidance is that it never resolves anything. It just delays the discomfort and usually makes it grow. So real relaxation looks like going for a walk, sitting in silence, having a conversation that makes you feel seen, or doing something slow and intentional. And the fact that those things sound quote unquote boring compared to scrolling is actually more evidence of how warped the loop has made your sense of what feels good. And so what ends up happening is you scroll to quote unquote rest and then feel more tired than when you started. And then because you feel tired, you scroll some more. And the cycle just keeps feeding itself in this way that makes genuine recovery almost impossible as long as the phone stays in your hand, or even in the room, honestly. And over time, this creates a kind of energy debt where you're always slightly behind. You're always slightly more drained than you should be. And you start to think that that's just who you are now. That's your baseline energy level. Someone who's already always tired, when really it's just the scroll eating your capacity to recharge. Now, people who cut their scroll time consistently report better sleep, more energy, better mood, and a lot more mental clarity within the first week. And that tells you everything about what the quote-unquote relaxation of scrolling was actually doing to them. Now, the third claim is that scrolling keeps you connected, that social media specifically helps you stay in touch with people, or know what's going on in your community, or it makes you feel like you're part of something. And this one has just enough truth in it to be convincing, but the version of connection that scrolling provides is so thin and hollow that it barely even counts. Now, most of what people call quote-unquote connection on social media is actually just passive observation, right? You don't actually connect. You just observe what's happening. Watching other people's highlight reels, reading their updates, seeing their photos, and none of that really involves the actual ingredients of real human connection like vulnerability, reciprocity, presence, or even genuine attention. What it often produces instead is comparison. This quiet measuring of your life against the curated version of other people's lives. And not the good kind of comparison where you become motivated because of it to change your own life. The worst kind of comparison where you actually feel more sad because your life is not up to par. And that comparison almost always leaves you feeling worse, which is the opposite of what connection is supposed to do. And study after study has confirmed that heavy social media use correlates with increased loneliness. And at some point, you have to take that data seriously, because the thing that's supposed to connect you is measurably making you more isolated, more lonely. Most of what gets posted online is a performance, a carefully selected version of someone's life, and engaging with performances all day trains you to perform too, which moves you further from the kind of honest, messy, real connection that actually matters with people. Now, the really concerning part is that scrolling doesn't just fail to provide real connection, it actually replaces it. Because the time and energy you spend scrolling is time and energy that could have gone towards the people physically around you, or towards reaching out to someone in a real and meaningful way. Think about how many times you've been sitting next to someone you love and both of you were on your phones. These days, you could be sitting with your grandma and both of you will be on your phones. That moment right there is the cost of the illusion. The real connection that was available and wasn't taken. Real relationships require depth. They require showing up fully and paying attention to being present. And scrolling trains you to do the exact opposite. It trains you for shallow, rapid, disposable engagement, which is fine for content consumption, but it's absolutely devastating for human connection. Right? And then there's the last one, which is probably the most honest reason people give. They scroll because they're bored. Nothing else to do. And this is where the framework we've been building really clicks into place, because the boredom you feel when you're not scrolling isn't real boredom. It's withdrawal from the scrolling. Like we talked about with the loop, the phone trained you to feel restless without it. And that restlessness feels exactly like boredom, but it's not. Real boredom existed before smartphones and people dealt with it fine. They daydreamed, they thought about things, they noticed their surroundings, they wrote, they created art. They sat with themselves. That version of boredom was actually useful. It was often where creativity and self-awareness came from. The boredom that scrolling creates is very different. It's an artificial itch that only exists because of the habit itself. So the more you scroll, the lower your tolerance for stillness gets. which is how you end up unable to wait in a line for 2 minutes without pulling out your phone. And that inability to sit with yourself for even a short time isn't boredom, it's dependency. The good news is that this recalibrates pretty quickly once you stop. Within a few days, maybe a week, your ability to be comfortable with nothing happening comes back, and what used to feel unbearable starts to feel normal again, and even pleasant. You'll start enjoying nothing happening. And here's what matters about all of this. When you stop using scrolling to fill every empty moment, you get something back that most people have completely forgotten they had, which is the ability to just be. To sit down with your own thoughts, to let your mind wander, daydream, process, without needing constant input. Almost every creative insight, every good idea, every moment of genuine clarity happens in those quiet, unstimulated moments that scrolling has completely eliminated from most people's days. And getting those moments back is worth more than any reel or short could ever give you. And beyond creativity, there's something even more basic at stake, which is your relationship with yourself. Your ability to know what you actually think and feel and want. Because you can't hear any of that over the noise of the constant content consumption. And the silence that comes when you stop scrolling is the same silence where self-knowledge lives. That capacity to be just with yourself, undistracted and unmediated, is honestly one of the most important things a person can have. And the fact that an app on your phone has quietly taken it from you without you even noticing is reason enough to walk away from the scroll for good. And if this is hitting home for you right now, if you can feel the weight of how much of your time and energy and focus has quietly been going to something that was giving you nothing back, I want you to know that getting your attention back is really just the first domino. I work with entrepreneurs, creators, professionals, high performers who want to master every area of their life, health, wealth, love, and self, with one complete system. And reclaiming your attention is one of the first things we fix because everything else depends on it. So there's a link in the description to book a call, and it might genuinely be one of the most important conversations you have this year. So if you're interested, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. Now, let's talk about the fear. So at this point, you probably see the loop, right? You probably see the illusion. And if those two things are landing, then there's only one left keeping you in it. And that's fear. Fear of what happens when you actually stop. What do you do? Fear of missing out, fear of boredom, fear of being disconnected, irrelevant, or left behind. Fear of having to sit with yourself without a screen to hide behind. And this is honestly the most important section because the only thing that actually makes it difficult to stop is really fear. The actual stopping is easy. It's the fear around the stopping that makes it feel impossible. So let's go through every fear you might have and really look at each one. The first one, and probably the biggest fear, is that you'll miss something important. That while you're not scrolling, some piece of content or news or trend will pass you by and you'll be out of the loop. The social one this time. And this fear feels incredibly real and urgent, even though when you actually examine it, it falls apart almost immediately. Think about all the content you've consumed in the last month of scrolling. I'm talking about specifically short form kind of scrolling. That's why we're talking about doom scrolling, but it can relate to long form content as well. How much of it was actually important? How much of it changed anything about your life or your decisions or your understanding of the world? Probably a very small part of it, or almost none of it. The vast majority was instantly forgettable, and the tiny fraction that might have been valuable you could have found in 5 minutes of intentional searching instead of hours of passive scrolling. Anything genuinely important will reach you through other channels, through conversations, through the news, through people telling you about it. And the idea that you need to constantly monitor an infinite feed to stay informed is just a story the platforms need you to believe to keep you engaged. And honestly, the quality of information you get from intentional chosen sources is so much higher than what the algorithm serves you. Because the algorithm optimizes for engagement and not for truth or usefulness. So you're actually less informed from scrolling, not more. Now, there's also the specific anxiety about not being current, not knowing the latest thing, not being able to participate in whatever conversation everyone's having right now. And that anxiety, I understand, but the thing it's protecting you from being slightly behind on a trend is so inconsequential in the actual context of your life that it's almost funny when you see it clearly. Trends move so fast now that even if you scroll for 4 hours a day, you still can't keep up with everything. which means you're already missing most of it, and somehow your life continues to function perfectly fine despite of that. The things that actually matter in your life, your health, your relationships, your work, your personal growth, none of those things are affected by whether you saw a trending video or not. And deep down, you already know that. Like, I don't have to be telling you any of this. 5 years from now, you will not remember a single reel you watched this week, but you will remember what you did with the hours you got back. And that's the only math that actually matters here. Now, the second fear is that life without scrolling will be boring. That you'll have all this empty time and nothing to do in it, nothing to fill it with. And like we covered in the illusion section, this fear is really just withdrawal disguised as some kind of prediction, and it's worth understanding that distinction clearly. The first few days without heavy scrolling will feel uncomfortable. True, that's honest. That discomfort, first off, was caused by the thing itself. But that's the withdrawal from the constant stimulation, not evidence that your life is actually boring. The discomfort passes. It passes faster than you'd expect. And what's on the other side of it is a version of your attention that you probably haven't experienced in years. People who cut back on scrolling consistently report rediscovering their interests that they might have even forgotten they had. Picking up books again, going for walks, having longer conversations, starting projects they'd been putting off. And none of that happens because they suddenly became more disciplined. It happens because they freed up the time and attention that scrolling was consuming. Now, the truth is that life without constant scrolling is richer. It is fuller. It is more textured. It is more present. And the only reason that sounds unbelievable is that the loop has been running for so long, you've forgotten what unmediated experience actually feels like. And beyond the adjustment period, there's something genuinely valuable about being able to sit with nothing happening, about being comfortable with stillness. And that's a capacity most people have completely lost. But it comes back quickly, and when it does, it changes the texture of your entire day. Some of your best thinking happens when you're not doing anything at all. You've probably had moments where you were just taking a walk and you got a crazy, amazing idea. When you're just sitting or walking or waiting. And scrolling has stolen those moments so completely that most people literally don't have a single unstimulated minute in their entire day. There's a kind of peace that comes from not needing constant input. And it's something you can actually feel in your body, a loosening almost, a settling, quiet that you didn't even know was missing until it comes back. And the beautiful thing is that this peace isn't something you have to build or earn or work towards. This peace that we're all looking for comes from just letting go of this phone. It's already there. It's been there the whole time. The scroll is just covering it up. Now, the third fear is social. The worry that if you're not on the platforms, you'll lose touch with people, maybe fall out of some groups, maybe become the person that doesn't know what anyone's talking about. And this fear has a little bit of truth to it, in the sense that, yes, some surface level social awareness comes from scrolling, but the trade-off you're making for that awareness is enormous. The kind of information you get from scrolling is so shallow that losing it barely counts as a loss. And what you gain in return, which is the time and presence to actually connect with people in real ways, is so much more valuable that the trade isn't even close. You might have to be slightly more intentional about staying in touch, like actually texting someone instead of just seeing their story, or calling someone instead of liking their post. And those intentional actions are worth 10,000 times more than passive consumption when it comes to real human connection. And honestly, if a relationship can only survive through mutual scrolling of each other's feeds, that relationship was already pretty empty, and redirecting that energy towards the people who actually matter to you in real and substantive ways is one of the best things you can actually do for your social life. Now, the deeper version of this fear is about belonging, about feeling like part of something. And the truth is that scrolling gives you a simulation of belonging without any of the real substance. And the more you rely on that simulation, the less you invest in real communities and relationships that could actually give you what you're looking for. The most connected people you know, the ones who seem most at ease socially, most grounded in their relationships, are almost never the ones glued to their phones. And that's not a coincidence. Real belonging requires presence. And presence requires attention, and scrolling consumes both. Every meaningful relationship in your life would benefit from you being more present and less distracted. And quitting the scroll doesn't disconnect you. It frees up the exact resource, your attention, that real connection demands. So you're not losing connection by stepping away from the scroll. You're upgrading the kind of connection you already have, from passive observation to active participation, from shallow to deep. And that upgrade changes everything about how you feel in your relationships as well, and how close you feel with people. A lot of people that say they don't have any friends, they have plenty of friends. They're just too busy scrolling to notice. And then there's a sneakiest fear of all, the one that most people don't even realize they have, which is the fear of who you'll be without the scroll. After years of this behavior, it becomes part of how you see yourself, part of your daily rhythm, right? And the idea of just not doing it anymore feels weirdly like losing something, even though intellectually you know you're losing nothing. Now, this is just habit talking, and habits feel like identity when they've been running for long enough, but they're not you, they're just patterns. And patterns can change, and the person underneath those patterns, the person who existed before the scroll, is still there and honestly probably wants out. Now, the attachment to the behavior feels real, but it's the same kind of attachment a smoker feels to cigarettes. It feels meaningful because of the repetition and not because of the value itself. And once you see through the attachment, it loses its grip entirely. On the other side of letting go of that identity is a version of you that has their attention back, has their time back, has their energy back. And that's a return to something you were always supposed to have. Now, the fear of change itself is real and deserves respect, but the change we're talking about here is small in practice and enormous in impact. And most people who make it look back and they really can't believe that they ever hesitated because the life on the other side is just so obviously better. Every person who's successfully cut their screen time will tell you the same thing, that the fears they had beforehand turned out to be almost entirely imaginary, and that the first week maybe was a bit strange, maybe it felt a bit uncomfortable, but after that they couldn't imagine going back. And ultimately, this is a choice between a known discomfort, which is the quiet drain of the scroll that you're already living with every day, and an unknown discomfort, which is a few days of adjustment. When you frame it that way, the decision becomes pretty clear, right? So if you're sitting here right now and you can feel the fears losing their grip, if you can see the loop and the illusion clearly, and you're ready to actually do something with the time and energy you're about to get back, that's exactly what we help people do. We work with entrepreneurs, creators, professionals, high performers to build one complete system for mastering their health, their wealth, their relationships, and their relationship with themselves. The scroll is honestly just the starting point. There's a link in the description. You can book a call if you want to talk about mastering every area of your life and how that looks like for your specific situation. With that said, let's continue with the exit. So here's where we actually talk about stopping. And if you've been paying attention up to this point, the stopping part is going to feel almost anticlimactic, right? And that's by design. The whole point of everything we've covered is that the hard part was never the quitting. The hard part was believing that you were giving something up. And you're not. You know that now. The loop isn't giving you anything. The entertainment, the relaxation, the connection, all of it is really an illusion. The fear of stopping was just the trap's last defense. And now that you see all of that clearly, the exit is just walking through a door that's been open the whole time. The only thing you actually need to stop is clarity. A clear and honest understanding of what the scroll was and what it isn't. And if you followed everything up to this point, well, you already have this clarity. So what remains is really just the practical side of actually changing the behavior, which is genuinely easier than you think. And it starts with a single, clean decision. Not a vague intention to scroll less or cut back. A clear, definitive decision that you're done with mindless scrolling, that you see it for what it is, and that you don't want it anymore. And the firmness of that decision is what matters more than any technique or strategy. The reason willpower approaches fail is that they leave the underlying desire intact. You still want to scroll, but you're forcing yourself not to. And that internal conflict is exhausting and obviously unsustainable because you're constantly going to have to fight yourself. This approach removes the desire, so there's no conflict, there's no struggle, there's no force. And this is where our thesis line lands. The only reason you want to see the next reel is because you watched the last one. So the last one you watched, whenever that was your final mindless scroll. Not because you're depriving yourself, because you're done with something that was never giving you anything. And here's something important. This isn't about never using your phone again, or never watching a video again, or going off the grid. This is about ending the mindless, habitual, loop-driven scrolling that eats your time and attention without your conscious consent. Intentional use is completely different from compulsive use, and you get to keep the former while letting go of the latter. Using your phone to call someone, to look something up, to watch something specific you've chosen, all of that is fine and normal. What you're stopping is the open-ended, algorithm-driven scroll session where you hand your attention over to a machine and let it decide what you see for the next 45 minutes. The difference between intentional and compulsive use is control. And control is exactly what the loop took from you, right? And getting it back is what this whole thing has been about from the start. Now, the actual mechanics of stopping are embarrassingly simple. And that simplicity is the point, because every complicated system of rules and limits and screen time trackers is just another way of staying in the loop while pretending that you're addressing it and doing something about it. So delete the apps, seriously, not temporarily, not as a detox, because you don't need them. And keeping them on your phone while trying to stop scrolling is like keeping cigarettes in your pocket while trying to quit. You're setting yourself up to fail on purpose. You can still access those platforms through a browser if you genuinely need to, but the friction of opening a browser, logging in, and actually going to the site is enough to break the autopilot loop, especially after this training, especially after you know the truth. And that friction becomes your best friend in the first week. Deleting the apps is also a signal to yourself that you're serious about this, that this isn't another half-hearted attempt. And that signal matters psychologically because it aligns your environment with your intention. And you want your phone to be a tool again, something you pick up for a reason and put down when the reason is done. And removing the infinite scroll apps is the single fastest way to make that happen. Now look, you're going to have more time than typically. The time you used to spend scrolling will open up, and for the first few days it will feel weird, like something's missing. And that's where having a few simple, low-effort alternatives already helps. A book by your bed, a walk after dinner, a conversation instead of a scroll. Nothing complicated, just something that's actually good for you in the space where the scrolling used to be. Now, the weird feeling passes within a few days, usually faster than that. And after it passes, the alternatives stop feeling like alternatives and start feeling like your life, the one you were living before the phone took over. Except now you're actually present for it, and you're actually enjoying it. And over time, maybe a few weeks, you'll start noticing things that are hard to explain but very real. Your attention span gets longer, your mood stabilizes, your sleep improves, your thinking gets clearer. All of those things compound on each other in ways that make the old scroll sessions look completely insane in hindsight. And this is what life actually looks like on the other side. And I want to be specific about it because vague promises don't really help anyone. And the actual lived experience of someone who stepped out of the scroll is remarkably different from what the fear told you it would be. Your mornings change first. Instead of reaching for your phone before your eyes are fully open, you just wake up. You lie there maybe for a minute, you think about your day, you get up and start moving without that foggy, already drained feeling that comes from 30 minutes of scrolling before you've gotten out of bed. There's a mental sharpness in the first hour of your day that most people haven't felt since before they got a smartphone. And that sharpness sets the tone for everything that follows. Your day starts with your own thoughts, your own plans, your own priorities, instead of whatever the algorithm decided to show you. And that shift from reactive to intentional changes how the entire day unfolds. Your evenings change too. The hours between dinner and bed stop being a scroll blur and start being actual time you can use for things that matter, conversations, projects, rest that actually rests you, right? And the cumulative effect of getting those evenings, hours, and nights back is something you genuinely have to experience to understand if you don't remember it anymore. Real rest, the kind where your nervous system actually calms down, becomes possible again once the scroll is gone. And the quality of your sleep improves in ways that affect everything else, your mood, your focus, your patience, your relationships. And maybe most importantly, you get space back, mental space, emotional space, the kind of quiet internal room where you can actually process your day, think about what matters, and feel like a person rather than a content consumption machine. So you start being present for the small moments that used to disappear into the scroll. A meal, a sunset, a conversation with someone you love. None of those things are dramatic, but they're real, and real is something scrolling never was. Now, the last thing to address is whether this sticks, whether you can really stop for good, or whether you'll inevitably slide back. And the answer depends entirely on whether you understood the earlier sections, because if you really see the loop, really see the whole illusion of this, really see the fear for what it is, there's nothing to slide back to. If you do find yourself picking up the phone and starting to scroll out of habit in the weeks after stopping, that's normal, and the response is simple. You just notice it, remember what you know about the loop, and put the phone down, and hopefully you delete the app. No starting over, just a gentle correction. So be easy on yourself about it. The habit was reinforced thousands of times over years, and it takes a little time for the autopilot to fully shut off. But every time you catch yourself and stop, the autopilot gets weaker, and eventually it goes quiet altogether. The first few days are the most important, and after about a week, most people report that the urge to scroll has dropped dramatically. And after 2 or 3 weeks, it's mostly gone, replaced by a completely new normal and some other habit that feels so much better that going back seems almost unthinkable. Now, long term, the key is remembering what the scroll actually was. Not entertainment, not relaxation, not connection, a loop, a trap, a system designed to extract your attention for profit. And as long as you remember that clearly, there's no temptation to go back because there's nothing to go back to. The platforms will keep trying. Of course, that's their job. They'll send notifications, they'll suggest new content, they'll optimize their algorithms. None of it works on someone who's actually seen through the illusion. The spell only works if you don't know it's a spell, and you know now. And so you're not giving anything up. You're not sacrificing enjoyment or relaxation or connection. You're stepping out of a loop that was taking all of those things from you. Every minute you spent scrolling was a minute stolen from your actual life. Getting those minutes back isn't loss, it's the exact opposite. With that said, let's go over the review. We talked about the overview, the loop, the illusion, the fear, the exit, the review, and finally your action items for the day or the next few days. First, spend one full day noticing every time you reach for your phone without a specific purpose, and just observe the loop in action without trying to change it. And just jot down every time you grab your phone so that you can get a specific number of the amount of times you actually grab your phone for no reason. Because that awareness alone will change your relationship with the behavior more than any rule or limit ever really could. Then remove every infinite scroll app from your phone today, not as a test or a trial, but as a permanent decision. And notice how the first wave of discomfort passes much faster than you expected it to. And then finally, use the time you get back for one thing you've been putting off, just one, whether that's a conversation, a walk, a book, or a project, and let yourself feel what it's like to spend your attention on something that actually matters. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful. If it was, let me know in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you want this document along with this training, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters on how to improve in every aspect of your life, then make sure to join the free newsletter from the link in the description. Once again, thank you for being here. Thank you for the support, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering is how to stop overthinking. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first the overview itself, the illusion of thinking, the addiction to control, the end of effort, the power of purpose, the natural end of overthinking, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. So before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you want this training along with its respective document, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. If you want weekly tips sent directly to your inbox on health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter again from the link in the description. If you like content like this, then make sure to subscribe, like the video, comment below to let me know what you'd like to see next. And with that out of the way, let's get started and talk about the illusion of thinking. All right, so if you're watching or listening to this, then you probably already know what it feels like to be stuck in your own head. It could be you're lying in bed at night replaying a conversation from 3 days ago or from 3 years ago for that matter, or you're sitting at your desk supposedly working, but your mind is really running through every possible way some future thing could go wrong. You catch yourself mid-spiral, you tell yourself to stop, and 5 minutes later, you're right back in it. That loop, that exhausting inability to just stop. I've been there, most people have. But the thing I want you to understand is that what you're dealing with is actually something very specific, almost like a program that is really running in the background that you didn't install and never agreed to. And once you see how it actually works, you can turn it off. That's what this training is all about. We're going to break down exactly what's happening when your mind won't shut up, why it feels so impossible to escape, and then I'm going to show you how to actually get free, not through years of meditation or therapy or willpower, but through simply seeing something clearly that you've never seen before. Now, the first thing I need you to understand is that most of what you call thinking isn't actually thinking at all. It's just mental noise. Real thinking is actually very rare. It's focused, it's intentional, it has a purpose, and it produces something useful at the end. What most people do when they're stuck in their heads, and probably what you're doing at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep, is just replaying, recycling, or rearranging the same fears and doubts over and over again, which feels like you're working on something important, but you're really just running in place, right? And this is the trap. You believe you're being responsible or careful or thorough, that you're thinking things through, when actually you're just running the same broken loop. Now, there's a massive difference between actual thinking and what we're calling overthinking, right? Real thinking has a direction. You sit down, you work through a problem, you arrive at something, and then you're done. Overthinking has no direction. It's circular. You go round and round the same territory without ever landing anywhere. And an hour later, you're more confused than when you actually started. Real thinking leaves you feeling clearer. Overthinking leaves you feeling drained and anxious. Real thinking is something you choose to do. Overthinking is something that actually happens to you, right? Often against your will. And here's a simple test. If you've been thinking about the same thing for days or weeks or months and you're no closer to a resolution, that's not thinking, right? That's rumination. That's a mental habit running on autopilot. Real thinking doesn't take that long unless you're solving some big academic research problem, right? Because real thinking actually goes somewhere. The tricky part is that the mind confuses these two things on purpose, because as long as you believe that overthinking is useful, you'll keep feeding it. The moment you see that it's not useful, that it never was, the whole thing starts to fall apart. Now, the mind has convinced you that all this mental activity is actually protecting you somehow, that if you stop analyzing, you'll miss something important or make a terrible mistake. But think about it honestly, right? How many of those endless mental rehearsals actually helped you? How many times did all that worry genuinely prepare you for something? Almost never. The overthinking creates the anxiety it then promises to solve, which is why it never ends. Every solution your mind offers just generates more problems to solve, and you stay trapped in what feels like necessary work, but is actually just the habit feeding itself over and over and over again forever, right? The way this works is very predictable once you see it clearly. You feel uncertain about something, so you start thinking about it, and then the thinking feels productive for a moment, like you're actually doing something responsible, but then it doesn't resolve anything because there's nothing to actually resolve. Because the future is unpredictable and the past is unchangeable. So you feel more uncertain than you were before, which triggers more thinking, which creates more anxiety, which demands more thinking, and round you go, right? And the thing is, at the end of all this mental effort, you're actually left with nothing. No clarity, no peace, no actual solution, just exhaustion and the vague sense that you should probably think about it some more tomorrow. Right? That's how you know it's an addiction rather than actual thinking. Real thinking produces results. This just produces more of itself. We've been sold this idea our whole lives that mental effort equals intelligence, that worrying means you care, that constant analysis is how smart people operate. That's not the case, right? The people who are actually clear and effective, the ones who seem calm under pressure, they're not the ones trapped in their heads all the time. They think when thinking is actually needed, and the rest of the time they're just present. They're just there, doing things, living, solving problems when they need to. That's the natural state we're trying to get back to. And the most important thing to understand here is that the overthinking creates the problem it claims to solve. You feel anxious, so you think about what's making you anxious. And the thinking makes you more anxious, so you think harder and it makes you even more anxious. The relief you get from analyzing is fake. It's just a brief pause in the tension that the analyzing itself actually created. It's exactly how alcohol relieves the stress that alcohol caused in the first place. The thing you think is helping is actually the source of the problem, right? And once you really see this, you'll realize you're not getting anything from the overthinking. Nothing real, nothing useful. It's giving you zero benefits while costing you your peace, your sleep, your energy, your presence, right? The trade is completely one-sided and you've been making it for years without realizing how bad the deal actually is. See, the problem was never that you think too much. The problem was that you mistook overthinking for real thinking. And so you kept feeding something that was never actually serving you. And this should come as a huge relief, because if overthinking were actually thinking, you'd be in real trouble, right? You'd need to somehow stop your own intelligence from working, which would be impossible. But that's not what's happening here, right? You're just caught in a mental habit that has nothing to do with your actual capacity to reason or solve problems or make decisions. The real you, the one who can actually think clearly and act decisively when it's actually needed, is still there underneath all that noise. You don't need to become someone different or develop some new skill. We just need to stop feeding the habit so the real version of you that can actually solve problems and think when it's needed can come back. So let's talk about the addiction to control. So now that we've established that overthinking isn't real thinking, let's look at why you keep doing it anyway. Because knowing something is useless doesn't automatically make you stop, right? There's clearly something deeper going on here, some reason your mind keeps returning to the same patterns even when they obviously don't work. And that reason, when you really look at it, is this deep craving for control. The reason you overthink is because somewhere along the way, you learn that thinking equals safety. That if you can just figure out everything in advance, you'll be protected from bad outcomes. This is the core belief underneath all of it, right? Your mind genuinely believes that by analyzing every possibility, rehearsing every scenario, worrying about every potential problem, it's keeping you safe from harm. And this belief feels so true, so obviously correct that you've never really questioned it. But here's the thing, it is completely false. Thinking about problems doesn't actually prevent them, right? Think about it. Worrying about the future doesn't really prepare you for it. Thinking about the past doesn't really change it. Mental rehearsal doesn't actually make you perform better. Often it makes you perform worse because you're tense and in your head. The whole premise is a lie. So this belief usually starts when you first discovered that thinking ahead could actually help you avoid trouble or please people or get better grades, and then over the years it got reinforced and exaggerated until it turned into this compulsive habit where you feel like you have to think about everything all the time or something bad will happen. The original learning wasn't wrong exactly, right? Sometimes planning is useful, but it got twisted into something pathological where you can't even stop when it's clearly hurting you. And underneath the craving for control is really just fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of making mistakes, fear of bad things happening that you didn't see coming. And fear that if you didn't see them coming, then you're maybe not as perfect as you thought you were, right? The overthinking is basically an attempt to manage that fear by thinking your way to safety, which of course doesn't work because the fear isn't rational in the first place. You can't think your way out of anxiety. You can only accept that life is uncertain and learn to be okay with that. And learn to be okay with the fact that you won't be able to see everything ahead of time. And that doesn't mean that, it does mean that you're imperfect, right? And that's okay. The control you think you're getting from all this mental activity is completely illusory. You feel like you're doing something productive, like you're on top of things, but nothing has actually changed in reality. The future is still unpredictable and it's still going to happen. Objectively, you still don't know what's actually going to happen. All you've done is exhausted yourself and raised your baseline anxiety. The control is fake. There is no control there. So the way the trap actually works is you feel anxious or uncertain about something, and then your mind interprets that feeling as a signal that you need to think about it, which is the same thing we talked about in the last section, right? So you start analyzing, and the analyzing temporarily reduces the anxiety because you feel like you're doing something. But then it comes back stronger because you still haven't resolved anything because there's nothing to resolve. And now you're even more convinced that you need to keep thinking. And this is the addiction cycle. The relief from overthinking is just the temporary absence of the anxiety that the overthinking itself created. You're not solving the problem, you're maintaining it. And when you try to stop, when you tell yourself, okay, I'm just going to stop thinking about this, you feel this uncomfortable, restless, anxious feeling that makes you want to start thinking again. That feeling is withdrawal, right? It's the same thing a smoker feels when they try to go without a cigarette, or an alcoholic feels when they go without alcohol, or any drug addict when they go without their drug of choice. The mind has become dependent on the mental activity, and when you take it away, even briefly, it panics. And most people interpret this panic as evidence that they really do need to keep thinking, which is exactly backwards. The discomfort is actually evidence that you are addicted, and the only way through is to let the discomfort pass without feeding the habit. Now, the mistake everyone makes is thinking that the way to stop overthinking is to think your way out of it, to figure out why you do it, to analyze the pattern, to understand the psychology. But that's just more thinking, right? That's the addiction finding a new way to basically justify itself. I'm not overthinking anymore. I'm just thinking productively about my overthinking problem. Do you see how that sounds? The only way out is really through the discomfort without engaging. You have to be willing to feel the anxiety of not thinking and not do anything about it. That's all. Just let it be there. It passes. It always passes. And each time you do this, each time you refuse to feed the loop, it gets weaker and the craving diminishes. The anxiety baseline drops. Eventually, you realize that you don't actually need to think about most things at all, and that life just works itself fine. Often better without all that mental noise, right? So overthinking gives you nothing, absolutely nothing, and it doesn't protect you. It doesn't prepare you. It doesn't make you smarter or more careful or more responsible. It just takes from you. It takes your peace. It takes your energy. It takes your presence. It takes your sleep, and it takes your relationships because you're never really there when you're stuck in your head. The trade is 100% one-sided. You're giving up everything real in exchange for something completely imaginary. And once you really see that, once it really clicks, you'll wonder why you ever fed the habit at all. But there's good news. You don't need to develop some special skill to stop. You don't need years of meditation practice or therapy or self-improvement work. You just need to see the trap clearly enough that you lose the desire to participate in it. That's the whole method. When you truly understand that overthinking gives you nothing and takes everything, you stop wanting to do it. The craving dies. You just stop, right? So let's talk about the end of effort. So this is maybe the most counterintuitive part of the whole training. And it's also probably the most important, which is that stopping overthinking doesn't require effort, like at all. In fact, effort is the problem. The whole I'm going to try really hard to stop thinking approach is doomed from the start. And I want to explain why that is so that you don't waste time doing it wrong. Now, most people approach this completely backwards because they treat overthinking like a behavior they need to suppress, like it's eating junk food, where you just resist the urge through sheer willpower. But overthinking doesn't work that way at all. And here's why. The moment you try to stop thinking, you're creating resistance, right? And resistance is just more mental activity, which means you're actually feeding the exact thing you're trying to stop. The effort itself creates the disturbance. Lao Tzu put it really well when he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the more you try to control things, the more they control you, right? And the same goes for this. When you put pressure on yourself to stop overthinking, you're adding another layer of mental noise on top of the mental noise that's already there. Because now you're thinking about not thinking, monitoring whether you're thinking, judging yourself for thinking, strategizing about how to think less. And all of that is just still more thinking, right? You haven't escaped anything. You've just given the habit a new form to take. And the harder you try, the worse it gets, because trying harder means more mental activity, more tension, more pressure, more self-monitoring, which all feeds the loop. This is why people can spend years working on their anxiety problem and never actually get better, because the work itself maintains the problem, right? Willpower is the wrong tool entirely for this job. Willpower works when you're trying to do something hard for the first time. It doesn't work when you're trying to stop doing something that's driven by unconscious craving, because the craving just waits for your willpower to run out, right? Which it always does, especially at the end of our day, right? And then it pulls you right back in. Now, the actual solution, like we've been building towards this whole time, is to see the trap so clearly that the desire to participate just disappears on its own. You don't have to force yourself to stop wanting something when you genuinely see it for what it is, and when you see that it's worthless and harmful. Think about it this way. You don't have to use willpower to stop eating food that you know is poisoned, right? Because once you see it's poisoned, you don't want it anymore. The seeing is the solution. So when you really understand that overthinking gives you nothing and costs you a ton, you stop wanting to do it. The craving dies. You just lose interest in the whole game. It becomes obviously pointless, and pointless things are easy to stop. And this is actually how all real change works. You don't have to force yourself to stop doing things you genuinely don't want to do. The struggle only exists when a part of you still believes there's something valuable in the habit. Once that belief is gone, once you've seen through the illusion, because it is an illusion, and once you've seen through that completely, the behavior falls away naturally with no effort required. So you're already not thinking most of the time. Right now, as you're watching or listening to this, or if you're reading it, you're not really overthinking, right? Your mind is engaged with the content, following along, and it's present. The natural state is already one of relative mental quiet, right? The overthinking is an interruption of that state, not the default, right? So we're not trying to create something new or achieve some advanced mental state. We're just actually trying to stop interrupting the piece that's already there underneath the noise. We're just going back to where we naturally are. And when you stop feeding the overthinking habit, you don't have to replace it with something or build a new skill or develop a practice. You just return to what was already there before the habit took over. Peace isn't something you build, right? It's what remains when you stop creating anxiety, when there's no chaos. That's peace, right? So the instruction here isn't try harder to stop thinking. The instruction is more like allow yourself to stop, right? Give yourself permission to not engage with it. Stop treating every worried thought like it deserves your attention, because it doesn't. It's just thoughts, right? There's thousands of them a day. You can't pay attention to each one of them. And trust that you'll be fine, that you don't need all that mental activity to function or to stay safe or to make good decisions. You've been sold the idea that you need to think consistently and constantly, but you don't. Most of life works perfectly fine, right? Often better without you really trying to figure it all out in advance. So, with that said, let's talk about the power of purpose. So the single most effective thing you can actually do to end overthinking is to have something real to do, right? Like an actual purpose, a goal, something you're actively moving towards that demands your attention and energy. And a written goal, even better, not a goal in your head that you overthink about. Because overthinking doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It happens when your mind has nothing better to do, which is why you'll notice it's always worse when you're idle or bored or directionless. Nature abhors a vacuum, right? Overthinking thrives in a vacuum of purpose. Your mind is constantly looking for something to do, something to work on, something to process. And if you don't give it something meaningful and real to engage with, it will just manufacture problems to solve, which is what overthinking is. The anxious overthinking fills the space that purpose should be filling. So in a weird way, the question isn't really how do I stop overthinking? It's what should I be doing instead? And once you have a clear answer to that second question, the first one tends to solve itself. So stagnant mental energy with nowhere productive to go turns into overthinking. But when you have a clear purpose, something you're actively building or working towards or trying to achieve, that energy gets channeled naturally into real productive thought and action. And there's simply less left over to waste on circular thinking. There's less energy, literally. And this is why busy people with clear goals that are written down tend to overthink less, not because they're better at managing their minds, but because their minds are genuinely occupied with real tasks, other things to worry about, right? They don't have the spare capacity for endless rumination. The work absorbs the energy that would otherwise turn into anxiety. And this is also why overthinking gets worse when you have too much free time, or when you're between projects, or when you're unclear about what you're doing with your life, or when you're in between jobs. The mind abhors a vacuum. Give it nothing real to work on and it will invent problems to chew on. So having a clear direction in life, something you're actually moving towards, gives your mind a natural organizing principle that makes the overthinking kind of irrelevant. When you know what you're trying to do, when you have actual goals you're working towards, most of the things you used to worry about just stop mattering, because you can evaluate everything in terms of, does this help me get where I'm going or not? And if it doesn't help, you don't need to think about it. That purpose creates a filter for life, right? And when you know what you want and you're actively pursuing it, the endless what should I do with my life and am I making the right choices type of overthinking just disappears, because you've already answered the question, you're already doing the thing. Now, Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, observed that people with a strong sense of purpose tend to suffer less psychologically, even in objectively terrible circumstances, because the meaning gives them something to orient towards that transcends their immediate discomfort. The same principle applies here, right? So if you're watching this and you're not clear on what you're actually trying to do with your life, or with this year, or even with this week, that might be a more important problem to solve than the overthinking itself. Because when you figure out what you want and start moving towards it, the overthinking often takes care of itself. Your mind has real work to do. It doesn't need to manufacture fake work anymore. The rumination loses its function. And this doesn't have to be some big life purpose either, right? That can change over time anyway. It can be something simple and small, a project you want to start, a skill you want to develop, a hobby you want to start, a bunch of books you want to read, a problem you want to solve, something that genuinely interests you and pulls your attention forward into action rather than backwards into worry. The specific goals matter less than having one and having it written down. The point is just to get your mind engaged with reality, with the actual world in front of you. Purpose pulls you out of your head and into actual doing. And even if you don't have any of that figured out yet, the best thing you can do is just do something. Anything. Clean your room, go for a walk, start a task you've been avoiding. There's an old saying that if you want to meet the devil, just do nothing and he'll come for you, right? Idleness is where overthinking lives. Movement, action is where it dies, right? And the beautiful thing is that when you're actually engaged in purposeful work, the mental state you're trying to achieve through all this effort just shows up naturally. The presence, the flow, the quiet mind, these aren't things you have to manufacture. They're a natural byproduct of being absorbed in something that matters to you. They're a natural byproduct of purpose. They just show up, right? They're inherent. So let's talk about the natural end of overthinking. So if you've been following along, you should be starting to see something pretty clear by now, which is that overthinking isn't really something you need to fight or fix or overcome through effort. It's something that ends naturally once you stop feeding it and once you see it for what it truly is. There's usually a moment, and it might happen while you're watching this, or it might happen later when you're going about your day, where something just clicks and you realize you've been doing something completely pointless for years, maybe decades, and you suddenly see that you don't have to do it anymore because there's genuinely nothing in it for you. That moment is the beginning of the end. Once you've really seen that overthinking gives you absolutely nothing, that the control is fake, that the preparation doesn't actually prepare you, that the whole thing is just an addiction pretending to be responsibility, you can't unsee it. And when that desire is gone,
you don't have to do anything special to maintain your freedom. You're not constantly fighting urges or using techniques to stay present or reminding yourself not to think too much. You're just free, right? And this is completely different than using willpower, where you're constantly battling your own mind, and the best you can hope for is a temporary victory before the next overthinking episode. This is permanent. This is easy because you're not suppressing anything. You've just lost interest. Because here's the thing you need to really get: overthinking is an addiction. And like any addiction, it's a vicious cycle that perpetuates itself, right? The relief you get from overthinking only relieves the anxiety that the overthinking itself created in the first place. It's completely circular. It feeds on itself, and once you start the cycle, it doesn't end on its own. It just keeps going until you're exhausted and it runs out of fuel for the night, only to start again tomorrow. So the only way to actually stop is to make a firm decision that you will not entertain the cycle, that you will not start it, right? Not I'll try to think less, no, not, or, I'll notice when I'm overthinking and then stop. No, right? The decision is I'm not starting. That's the decision, period. Because once you start, you're already in the loop. And the loop is self-sustaining. It perpetuates itself. If you start it, it continues. Your goal isn't to stop overthinking once it's happening. Your goal is to notice the cycle trying to begin and just not start. Just not participate, right? So what does life actually look like on the other side of this? It's honestly kind of boring to describe, right? You just live. You deal with things as they come up. You think when thinking is actually useful, like when you're solving a real problem or planning something concrete. And then the rest of the time, you're just present, engaged with whatever's in front of you, and you're not lost in some mental simulation of a future that doesn't exist yet, or a past that's already gone and unchangeable. And the weird thing is, you actually perform better at life when you're not overthinking, right? Your decisions are clearer because they don't come from anxiety. Your relationships are better because you're actually there. Your work is better because you can actually focus. The thing you feared losing, the edge you thought that the overthinking gave you, was never real, right? And you start to trust yourself that you can actually handle whatever comes up in the moment without having to rehearse it in advance. Life becomes way more fluid and just more alive. The constant need to prepare and analyze and figure things out in advance, it just dissolves. And you become someone who can actually respond to life as it happens rather than living in their head. And that's when life becomes beautiful with its ups and downs, right? So that's it, really. Overthinking is really an illusion disguised as thinking. It gives you nothing and costs you everything, and you don't stop it through effort. You stop it by seeing through it so clearly that you lose the desire to do it. And when you have something real to move towards, something that engages your mind and energy in a meaningful direction, the overthinking loses its function entirely and dies on its own. That's the method. That's all it is. And if you've been paying attention, really paying attention, you might be there already, right? You might have already felt something changing. You might have had this aha moment during this training. The sense of, oh, I don't actually have to do this anymore. And it really is that simple. We complicate things because we think things should be hard, and some are and some aren't, right? That it should require years of work and discipline and struggle. Some things do, some things don't. But sometimes the deepest changes can really happen in an instant. The moment you see something clearly that was hidden before. And once you've seen it, you're basically done. The only thing left is to just not go back, right? And you won't want to, because why would you return to something that gives you absolutely nothing? So with that said, let's go over the review. We talked about the illusion of thinking, the addiction to control, the end of effort, the power of purpose, the natural end of overthinking, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. First, recognize that what you've been calling thinking is actually just mental noise disguised as productivity. Real thinking has direction and it produces results. Overthinking is circular, it gives you nothing and it costs you everything. The control is fake, the preparation doesn't actually prepare you, and the moment you can tell the difference, you've already started to get free. Second, don't try to fight or suppress the overthinking through willpower. That just adds more mental activity on top of the mental activity that's already there. It just adds more thinking to the thinking. Instead, let the craving die by seeing through the illusion so completely that you lose the desire to actually participate. When an old thought pattern starts up, just recognize it for what it is, noise pretending to be useful, right? And let it pass without engaging. And finally, get clear on what you're actually trying to do with your life, or with this year, or even just this week, or even just today. Have something real to move towards that demands your attention and energy. Purpose fills the vacuum that overthinking would otherwise fill, and it gives your mind something meaningful to engage with so it doesn't have to manufacture fake problems to solve. And if it's late at night and you're overthinking, then make sure you have set some goals for the next day so you can actually just focus on them, right? Focus on going to sleep so you can attack your goals the next day. That's all you have to do. And don't engage with the overthinking. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this training. If you did, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment below what you'd like to see next. Again, if you'd like to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you want this training along with its document, then make sure to join the free community, again, from the link in the description. And if you want weekly tips sent straight to your email inbox, then make sure to join the newsletter, again, from the link in the description. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to see you in the next one.
All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is how to dismantle stress forever. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be covering more specifically is first the overview itself, the illusion nobody talks about, the machinery behind mental paralysis, the wisdom of wait and will, the path that runs straight through, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one to master every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, make sure to book a call from the link in the description or the pinned comment, and we'll talk about it. With that said, let's actually get started and talk about the illusion that nobody talks about. So before we get into the mechanics and the philosophy and all the practical stuff, we need to talk about the one thing that tends to keep people stuck in stress cycles forever. And it's not the stress itself. It's the way you've been taught to think about stress. Because for most of us, the entire framing is off. And once you see how it's off, everything else in this training will make a lot more sense. So most people tend to treat stress like it's some external force that basically attacks them out of nowhere. Something that just happens to them when life gets hard. And that framing is probably the single biggest reason they never get free of it. The way stress gets talked about in self-help and popular psychology, you'd think it just rolls in without any warning and there's nothing you can do but brace for it. But what's actually happening for a lot of people is something much simpler and honestly, much more fixable. Stress, in most cases, is not the event itself. It's the mental spin you generate on top of the event. And that spin is where almost all of the real suffering actually lives. Now, the most effective way to break free of any destructive mental pattern is never about fighting the pattern with willpower. It's always about realizing that the thing you are fighting is largely an illusion. And once you truly see through that trick, there is nothing left to fight against. And stress, for a lot of us, tends to follow this exact same loop where something happens, you build a story around it, the story creates tension, and then you spend all this energy trying to manage the tension without ever going back to question the story that started the whole thing in the first place. The moment you stop treating that mental narrative as hard fact and start seeing it for what it actually is, which is just another thought that popped up and feels convincing, a lot of the emotional charge tends to fall away on its own without you ever having to do anything. And I'm not saying you should pretend that your problems are fake or act like nothing matters and nothing is really happening. It's about noticing that your reaction to the problem is usually doing significantly more damage than the problem itself. And that gap between what actually happened and what your mind made of it is really something that you can genuinely learn to work with. And the beautiful part is that once you see this mechanism clearly, you probably can't unsee it, which is the entire point of understanding it. Now, the stress response you feel, that tightness, that low-grade dread, and that sense of something is about to go wrong, most of the time it's not really pointing to any real danger in front of you. It's pointing at a future you most likely imagined, a scenario your mind constructed from fragments of past experience and general worry about what could possibly happen next. Now, your body doesn't actually know the difference between a real threat and an imagined one, which means you can sit in a perfectly safe room and flood yourself with the exact same chemicals you'd produce if something genuinely dangerous were happening right in front of you. Now, once you realize that, once you truly get that you are often manufacturing the very feeling you're trying to escape, it changes your entire relationship with the experience. It's not something happening to you anymore. It's something you're doing to yourself, and you can learn to stop. Now, there's something that gets missed almost every time people talk about stress. And I think it changes the whole conversation. There is a real and meaningful difference between chosen stress and imposed stress. And most people lump them together like they're the exact same experience when they're fundamentally not. So chosen stress is what shows up when you commit to something that actually matters, when you take on weight deliberately because the outcome is worth carrying it for. And that's a completely different animal from the stress that gets dropped on you without your permission. Now think about someone training for a competition or building a business from nothing or raising a kid. That stress is real. Nobody's saying it isn't. But the fact that you chose it on purpose changes everything about how it feels. It's not suffering in the traditional sense. It's more like the soreness after a workout, the feeling that tells you that you're actually growing. And most people who feel this kind of stress would actually feel worse without it because it's connected to something they genuinely care about. Now, the problem starts when people forget they chose the hard thing and begin treating their own voluntary commitment like a prison sentence someone forced on them, which then tends to happen gradually and subtly over time. When the why behind the effort stays clear and present in your mind, the stress stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like fuel, like evidence that you're in motion and engaged with something real. Imposed stress is the other kind, and it's the stuff that genuinely lands on you from outside without any say on your part. A health scare, a layoff, someone you trusted letting you down, circumstances you couldn't have predicted and definitely didn't sign up for. Now, this kind of stress can feel heavier in some ways because there's no narrative of choice to hold on to. But even as a quick side strategy, before we move on, there's something you can do with imposed stress that changes the entire feeling of it almost instantly. You take extreme ownership of it. Whatever landed on your lap that you didn't ask for, you look at it and you say, this is mine now. I'm choosing to deal with this. I'm choosing to face it. I'm choosing to handle it on my terms. And what that does psychologically is move the experience from the imposed category into the chosen category. And yes, you didn't choose the event, but you can choose your response to it with full force and full commitment. And that change from passive recipient to active owner tends to dissolve a surprising amount of the heaviness that actually comes with feeling like life just happened to you. And it can be as simple as saying, I'm choosing this. I know it sounds simple and maybe even a bit funny, but if you open your mind and use it, it can put you in a completely different state. But even here, even with the legitimately imposed stress, the same principle still tends to apply. The event is the event. What makes it unbearable for most people is not the event itself, but the endless replaying and catastrophizing and mental looping that actually follows it. So learning to separate the actual situation from your mental commentary about the situation is probably the single most useful skill you'll ever develop when it comes to dealing with things you didn't choose and can't control. And the moment you make that separation, even just partially, you start to feel like you have some say in the matter again, which for most people is what they actually needed all along. Now, here's where it starts to get really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable for some people. The stress you feel on a daily basis, that background tension that so many people describe as just being their normal state of existence, is in most cases being generated by a story you're telling yourself that you've repeated so many times it doesn't feel like a story anymore. And the story tends to have a very particular structure to it. Something bad is happening or about to happen. I'm not ready for it. I can't handle it. And if I don't figure this out, something terrible is going to follow. So the thing about this kind of internal storytelling is that it feeds on itself in a way that can be really hard to interrupt unless you know what you're looking for. You feel stressed, which makes you think something must be wrong, which generates more stress, which confirms the original feeling. And now you're spinning in a loop that has no exit because the proof and the problem are the same thing. Now your brain is incredibly good at finding evidence for whatever it already believes. So once the stress narrative is running, everything you encounter starts to look like confirmation that you should indeed be stressed. So breaking the loop often just requires one honest moment of asking yourself whether the thing you're stressed about right now is actually happening right now, or whether you're reacting to a projection of something that might happen later. And for a lot of people, stress has become the default setting, the background noise they're so used to that they don't even recognize it as optional anymore. And it's basically like living next to a highway. After a while, you stop hearing the traffic, but it's still affecting everything: your sleep, your mood, your ability to think clearly and be present. Just because something feels normal doesn't mean it's necessary. So the possibility that you could exist without that constant baseline tension is something most people have never actually considered. Not because it's unrealistic, but because they've never been shown that the tension is something they're generating themselves rather than something the world is inflicting on them. So let's talk about what's actually happening under the hood when you experience what people call stress, because understanding the mechanism itself is really what makes this whole approach work. So here's how the cycle tends to work for a lot of people. You create tension by overthinking a situation. You then try some coping mechanism or distraction to relieve the tension. The coping works temporarily, and then the overthinking returns because you never addressed the root of the problem. You only managed the symptom. The relief never lasts because you're treating what's on the surface while the thing underneath keeps producing more of the same feeling. Now, the root, in most cases, is not the external situation at all. It's your relationship to uncertainty and your habit of filling that uncertainty with worst-case narratives. And until you address that habit at its source, no other stress management technique will do anything more than temporarily take the edge off. Now, most stress advice operates entirely at the surface level, at the symptom level, giving you tools to cope with the feeling of stress without ever helping you understand why you keep producing the feeling of stress in the first place. So going deeper means looking at the assumptions you're carrying about what stress is and what it means about you and what it's trying to protect you from. Because in a lot of cases, it's not protecting you from anything real. And that can be a confronting thing to sit with, honestly, because it means taking some responsibility for an experience you've probably been blaming on your circumstances or your job or your relationships or just life in general. Now, the genuinely freeing part of all of this is how simple it tends to be once you see it. Not easy necessarily, but because seeing through a pattern you've been running for years takes some willingness to be uncomfortable for a moment, but it is simple. The stress was never the problem. Your interpretation of the stress was the problem. And interpretations can actually change. And that distinction from fighting the feeling to questioning the interpretation is what makes the difference between someone who manages stress and someone who actually gets free of it. For some people, this makes sense instantly, like a switch flipping. For others, it's more gradual, more of a slow dawning. Either way is fine. The point is that once the mechanism is seen, it loses most of its power. Now, everything we're going to cover from here on out, the philosophy, the psychology, the practical application, all of it sits on top of this one idea. Stress is not what it appears to be for most people. It's not an accurate reflection of how bad your life is or how many problems you have. It's a reflection of how your mind is processing uncertainty and discomfort, and that processing can be updated once you see how it works. That's the foundation. And with it in place, the rest of this starts to make a lot more sense. So think of this section as the lens adjustment that makes everything else in the training come into focus. Because without it, the ideas ahead might sound interesting, but they won't make sense the way they need to in order to actually change something for you. What comes next is going to go deeper into the specific triggers and patterns that tend to generate the most stress for people, and knowing that the mechanism is largely self-generated gives you a fundamentally different starting point for dealing with each one. And it also means you can actually approach the rest of this with a little more confidence, because you're not walking into a battle. You're walking into a conversation with yourself about how you've been thinking, and conversations can always go differently than they have before. The promise of this whole training, and I want to be upfront about this, is not that you'll never feel uncomfortable or tense again or stressed again. That will be honestly dishonest. The promise is that you'll understand what's actually happening when those feelings show up, and that understanding alone tends to take away most of the power those feelings have over you. This is about getting real with yourself about what stress is and what's just thinking you've never actually questioned. And if that sounds like something worth exploring, then obviously you're already in the right place to hear the rest of what's coming. So let's talk about the machinery behind mental paralysis. So now that we've established what stress actually tends to be for most people, let's look at the specific things that actually generate it. Now, contrary to what you might believe or think, it's not random. There are very predictable patterns that create the overwhelming majority of daily stress. Once you know what they are, they become a lot easier to catch in real time before they spiral into something that feels unmanageable. Now, the first one is indecision. This one is probably responsible for more unnecessary suffering than almost anything else on this list. And the reason is built right into the word itself. The Latin root, decidere, literally means to cut off. To decide is to kill every other option, to take the scissors to every alternative path and commit fully to the one you chose. And most people simply will not do that, because cutting off options feels like loss. And we are hardwired to avoid loss. We are loss averse, even when the thing we're losing is just an idea we were never going to act on anyway. So what happens instead is you sit in the middle, not choosing, not committing, keeping your options theoretically open, while burning enormous amounts of mental energy running simulations on which path might possibly turn out to be the best one. And that limbo state, that permanent maybe, is one of the most stressful places a human mind can live because it never resolves. There's no completion, there's no relief, there's just more weighing and more calculating and more worry about getting it wrong. And in that state, any decision will be the best one. So the irony is that by trying to avoid the pain of choosing wrong, you end up living in a state that's probably worse than any wrong choice could ever be. Because at least a wrong choice gives you feedback and movement and something concrete to work with. The real cost of indecision isn't that you might miss the best option. The real cost is that while you're deliberating, you're not doing anything at all. And time is passing. And the stress of inaction is compounding in the background. And any choice will be better than making no choice. And even better, you can build the identity of a person that could make any choice the best choice. Now, underneath most indecision, if you're honest about it, is some version of FOMO, or opportunity cost anxiety. The fear that whatever you choose, you'll miss out on the thing you didn't choose. And that missing out will be worse than where you end up. But what actually tends to happen in reality for most people who stay in that holding pattern is they don't end up with the best of both worlds. They think they do. They end up with neither. They get the stress of wanting both things, plus the reality of having committed to nothing. Or let's say they do decide to chase both options. They somehow get both, which is very rare, but let's say they do. But now they have to maintain both, so they add even more stress to their lives. So keeping options open feels like freedom, but it's actually a kind of prison, because freedom without direction is really just spinning in circles, and spinning in circles is exhausting. The truth that most people resist is that a committed wrong choice, whatever wrong even means, almost always puts you in a better position than an uncommitted right one. Because commitment generates momentum, and momentum generates clarity, and clarity is what you actually need to make better choices going forward. And there's no such thing as 99% committed. You're either fully committed or you're not. So what you need to do here is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. Cut. Decide. Let the other options die. And watch how quickly the stress lifts once there's nothing left to deliberate about. Now, the second big stress generator, and this one runs a little deeper, is conflicting desires. This is different from indecision about external options. This is about wanting two things simultaneously that genuinely cannot coexist in the same life at the same time, and the tension between them creates a low-grade war inside you that you might not even be fully aware of. So you want freedom, but also security. You want to party all the time, but also achievement. You want to be liked, but also to speak honestly, which by definition means that sometimes you won't be liked. You want comfort, but also growth. These aren't just abstract philosophical tensions. These are real, lived contradictions that tend to show up in every important area of life, and they're responsible for a lot of the stress that people can't seem to trace back to any single cause. Now, the reason this kind of stress is so hard to identify is that it doesn't feel like stress about something specific. It feels generalized, like a background unease that's always there. What's actually happening is an internal tug of war, where part of you is pulling one direction and another part is pulling the opposite direction. And you're stuck in the middle, absorbing all the tension without ever resolving the pull. So the resolution here, and it's not always comfortable to get to, is radical honesty with yourself about which desire is the one you actually want, what need does it meet, which desire is actually yours, and which one you inherited or absorbed from other people's expectations, your culture, your upbringing, or some version of success that was handed to you before you were old enough to question it. So a surprising amount of what people think they want when they actually sit down and examine it turns out to be stuff they were told they should want by parents or peers or media or some unexamined cultural script that's been repeated since childhood. And the moment you get honest enough to say this desire isn't actually mine, I was just carrying it because I thought I was supposed to, a huge amount of the internal conflict just dissolves. And for the desires that are genuinely both yours, where you really do want both things and neither is actually inherited, well, the path forward is usually about integration rather than elimination. Finding a way to honor both in different contexts or at different times rather than trying to crush one in favor of the other. Sometimes this looks like seasons, periods where you lean more heavily into growth, followed by periods where you maybe prioritize rest, and accepting that rhythm instead of trying to be everything at once all the time. And sometimes it just means giving yourself permission to want contradictory things without treating that as evidence that something is wrong with you, because it's not. It's just what it feels like to be in a complex situation, a complex person with more than one dimension. However, you can't do everything all at once. Now, open loops are probably the most practical and immediately fixable source of stress on this entire list. And most people are drowning in them without realizing it. An open loop is anything you've committed to, thought about, or started that hasn't been completed, canceled, or consciously deferred with a clear plan for when you'll deal with it. So every unanswered email that you intended to answer, every half-finished project, every vague promise you made, every idea you had that you wrote down somewhere and then you forgot about. Each one of those is running in the background of your mind like a browser tab you can't see, but that's still draining your battery. Now, the thing about open loops is that individually, any single one of them is trivial. It's not that big, right? It's no big deal, but they do accumulate. And after a while, you've got 30 or 40 or 60 of these tiny unresolved commitments pulling at your attention, and the cumulative weight of them creates this feeling of being overwhelmed that seems completely out of proportion to what's actually on your plate. So your brain, it turns out, is remarkably bad at letting go of unfinished things. There's a well-known psychological phenomenon around this where incomplete tasks stay active in your mental workspace and keep demanding processing power even when you're focused on something else entirely. It's called the Zeigarnik effect, named after the psychologist Bloema Zeigarnik, who first studied it in the 1920s. She noticed that waiters in a restaurant could remember complex unpaid orders in perfect detail, but the moment that the bill was settled, the entire order vanished from their memory almost instantly. The brain treats unfinished business as priority that it refuses to close. And it will keep looping back to it and nudging you with low-level anxiety until the task is either completed or consciously resolved in some way. And this is actually a feature of our brain designed to keep important things from slipping through the cracks. But in a modern life, where you might have dozens or hundreds of these threads open simultaneously, that feature starts working against us because your brain can't distinguish between a genuinely urgent incomplete task and a half commitment that you made 3 weeks ago that doesn't actually matter anymore. And so people walk around feeling exhausted and stressed and stretched thin, and when someone asks them what's wrong, they say they don't really know. It's just everything. But it's not everything. It's 50 tiny somethings that were never properly closed. So the fix is almost absurdly simple, even though very few people actually do it consistently. You go through every open loop and you do one of 3 things with it. First, you list them out. That's step 0. Then you complete it right now if it takes less than a few minutes. Or you schedule a specific time to deal with it if it's bigger than that. Or you consciously drop it entirely and accept that it's not going to happen, and that's fine. That third option of dropping it is the one most people struggle with because it feels like failure or irresponsibility, or it feels like they're missing out on something. Again, back to the FOMO. But carrying a commitment you're never going to actually fulfill is way more irresponsible than letting it go, because at least when you let it go, key point, you've made a choice and decided, back to the previous one, you free up the mental space for things you actually will follow through on. So you need to be able to decide. Once again, you need to cut off options and be okay with the quote-unquote opportunity cost and the quote-unquote fear of missing out. Now, the relief that comes from even a single session of closing open loops is sometimes so immediate and so big that people are genuinely shocked by how much lighter they feel afterwards. So making this a regular practice or a weekly sweep of open loops is probably one of the most tangible things you can do to reduce your baseline stress level, and it requires zero philosophy or mindset work at all. Just basic mental housekeeping every Sunday. And building on that, and on what we just covered with open loops, there's a really practical framework that tends to cut through a lot of the noise when it comes to stress that follows you home from work or creeps in during your downtime. When you strip it all down, there are really only 3 types of things that cause stress to show up in your mind outside of your working hours. Each one has a straightforward path to resolution that takes the weight off almost immediately. Now, the first is something you forgot to do. So it's some task or commitment that slipped through the cracks, and now it's sitting in the back of your mind, pulling at your attention during hours when you should be resting or present with the people around you. Now, the fix here is almost too simple to feel real. Write it down. That's it. Get it out of your head and onto paper or a screen. and resolve to handle it first thing when you're back at your desk or when you can. That's it. The stress isn't about the task itself, by the way. It's about the fear of forgetting it again, which is an open loop again, back to the open loops we discussed. And the moment you capture it somewhere reliable, that fear dissolves. So your brain is not really a storage device, it's a processing tool. And the moment you stop trying to use it to hold on to every outstanding item and start offloading those to an external system, the mental load drops in an almost disproportionate way to how simple the action was. Now, the key piece here is the resolve, right? It's not enough to just write it down. You actually need to attach a clear intention to deal with it at a specific time, because as we discussed, half commitments create almost as much background stress as forgotten tasks do. Now, the second is something you realized you messed up. This is the second source of stress. Maybe it was an email you sent too quickly. Maybe it was a deadline you missed, a conversation where you said the wrong thing. Whatever it is, the stress here comes from the gap between what happened and what you wish had happened. And it tends to loop endlessly if you don't give it a clear resolution path. So you ask yourself one honest question. Is it fixable or not? If yes, you write it down and make a note to fix it as soon as you're able to. If not, you may need to make amends, but then you need to let it go. Meaning genuinely let it go. Carrying it around doesn't undo it and doesn't help anyone, least of all you. So most mistakes honestly are more fixable than they feel in the moment. The stress inflates the severity, and once you actually sit down to address it, you often find it's a 10-minute correction that your mind turned into a 3-day ordeal. And for the ones that genuinely can't be undone, the practice of just making amends and then releasing it is one of the most freeing things you can do. Not because it erases the mistake, but because holding on to it after you've done what you can is really just self-punishment. So every mistake you face directly and resolve cleanly becomes a data point that builds your confidence for the next one. And over time, that pattern of facing rather than avoiding will compound into a fundamentally different relationship with imperfection. A lot of the times also our mind loops on our mistakes or the things that we didn't do correctly because it's trying to extract a lesson from those situations. And until you sit down and actually write down what the lesson was, what is the feedback you got from the whole situation? What is that lesson? What is that one thing or insight that you're going to take from it so that this doesn't repeat again? Until you sit down and do that, your mind is going to keep looping the same mistake on purpose. It's trying to make you not forget it because it doesn't want it to happen again. So it keeps it at the front of your mind at all times. And the only way for you to stop that is by actually sitting down, thinking about the mistake you made and extracting a lesson from it. And then from then on, every time that mistake comes up in your mind, you can just basically tell yourself that, hey, we've extracted the lesson here. We've extracted the insight. I can let this go now. It will not repeat anymore. I found my lesson. And then your mind will calm down because now you have extracted the insight from the whole situation. Now, the third source of stress here, and this might seem crazy to think that it can cause stress, but the third one is a new idea. Something that pops into your head unexpectedly, an insight, a creative spark, a connection you suddenly see between two things that maybe felt unrelated before. These feel different from the other two because they're exciting rather than anxiety producing, even though anxiety and excitement kind of feel the same. But they can also create stress in their own way because your mind doesn't want to lose the ideas. It keeps circling back, rehearsing the idea, trying to hold on to it. So what you need to do is the same as the first two. Just write it down and commit to acting on it once you're back in a position to do something with it. Now, ideas are fragile and they're also valuable, and your mind knows that, which is why it won't stop reminding you until you've gotten the thought down somewhere external. The faster you capture it, the faster your mind lets go of the need to keep rehearsing it. And over time, this will build a kind of trust between you and your own system. Your brain learns that when something important comes up, it will be captured and dealt with. And that trust will reduce the baseline need to keep everything running in your mental background. Now, there's also a concept from Buddhist teaching that maps onto everything we've been talking about, and it's one of the most useful frameworks for understanding stress or suffering that I've come across, and it's called the second arrow. Now, the idea is that when something painful happens, that's the first arrow, and you can't always avoid first arrows. They're just obviously part of being alive. But then almost immediately after the first arrow lands, you fire a second one at yourself. And that second arrow is your reaction to the pain, your narrative about the pain, your judgment of yourself for being in pain, and your anxiety about what the pain means for the future. And that second arrow, in most cases, does far more damage than the first one ever did. The first arrow might be a rejected proposal, a difficult conversation, or an unexpected bill. The second arrow is the 3 sleepless nights catastrophizing about what it means, replaying the situation over and over, imagining worst-case scenarios that haven't happened and probably never will. Now, the disproportion between the actual event and the mental response to the event is sometimes staggering once you start paying attention to it. A 10-minute problem can generate 3 days of suffering if you let the second arrow do its thing. And for many people, firing that second arrow isn't a choice they make consciously, it's a deeply ingrained habit, something that happens automatically the moment discomfort shows up, and it takes real awareness to actually catch it before it launches. So the idea here is really straightforward, even though it takes some patience to develop. When something stressful happens, you try to notice the gap between the event and your response. And that gap can be very, very small. Maybe just a fraction of a second, but it's there. And in that gap is where you have a choice. You can let the narrative spin up and carry you away, or you can feel the first arrow, acknowledge that it's unpleasant, and then deliberately choose not to launch a second and third and fourth. Now that gap will get wider with practice, almost like a muscle that strengthens over time. And as it widens, you'll start to experience events more clearly, more as they actually are rather than through the filter of all the story you usually add on top. And what most people discover when they get even a little bit good at this is that the vast majority of stressful events, stripped of the second arrow, are actually pretty manageable, right? It was the story that made them feel impossible. And this connects to maybe the most practical insight in this entire section, which is the fundamental asymmetry between thinking about doing something and actually doing it. The amount of mental energy and stress that goes into worrying about a task, dreading a conversation, putting off an email, avoiding a decision, it's almost always, in real practical terms, significantly greater than the energy it would take to just do the thing, right? You spend 3 weeks stressed about a phone call that takes 11 minutes, maybe. You spend 6 months dreading a project that takes 2 focused afternoons. You lie awake at night over an email that takes 4 sentences to write. The weight of the anticipation is orders of magnitude heavier than the weight of the action itself. And once you start noticing this pattern, you see it absolutely everywhere in your life and in the lives of the people around you. And this reveals something important about the nature of stress for most people. It's not really about how hard your life is or how much you have to do. It's always about how much you're thinking about what you have to do versus how much you're actually doing. So the stress to action ratio is almost always wildly skewed towards the stress side, which means the solution in most cases is not to reduce what's going on your plate, but to reduce the gap between deciding to do something and actually doing it. And what tends to happen once you just start is that the stress drops almost immediately because you're now engaged with reality instead of wrestling with your imagination about reality. You're dealing with what's actually in front of you instead of the 67 versions of what is going on in your mind that your mind basically generated while you were putting it off. So action is genuinely one of the most underrated stress reducers there is, and it doesn't require any mindset shift or philosophical understanding. Quite the opposite. You just dumb yourself down and do the thing. And the relief is so immediate and so tangible that it almost feels like cheating. And it compounds too, because every action you take closes an open loop. which reduces background stress, which gives you more mental energy, which makes the next action easier to take, and so on and so forth in a positive spiral that's the exact opposite of the negative spiral most people are stuck in. So, with that said, let's actually cover the wisdom of wait and will. So, we've looked at the practical machinery of stress, the patterns that generate it on a daily basis as well. But there's a deeper layer underneath all of this that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. And understanding it doesn't just help you manage stress better, it changes your fundamental relationship to discomfort or effort and the experience of being alive in a world that will never be fully within your control. And this section might feel a bit more abstract at first, but stick with it because it circles back to something deeply practical. So, Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who spent most of the 1800s being relentlessly honest about the nature of human experience, had this idea he called the will. And it wasn't willpower or determination, the way we usually think of those words. It was something more fundamental than that. The will, for Schopenhauer, was this blind, restless, never satisfied driving force underneath everything you do and everything you feel. This constant wanting and striving and reaching for the next thing that never stops no matter how much you achieve or acquire. So you get the job you wanted and immediately start worrying about the next promotion. You buy the house and start thinking about the renovation. You finish the project and you feel empty until you start the next one. That's the will. It's working exactly as designed, which is to keep you moving, keep you wanting, keep you in a state of perpetual dissatisfaction that propels you forward whether you like it or not. In other words, you can also call it hedonic adaptation. And this is an incredibly important thing to understand when it comes to stress, because it means that a certain amount of restlessness and dissatisfaction isn't something wrong with you. It's the baseline condition of being a conscious creature with desires. There's something genuinely relieving about hearing that too, for a lot of people, because they've been operating under the assumption that if they just got their life sorted out enough, the tension would finally stop. But that's not the case. You'll still want more. And Schopenhauer is basically saying, no, it won't, and that's okay. The tension is the engine. The question is whether you're going to be dragged around by it unconsciously or learn to work with it on your own terms. So Schopenhauer's suggestion, broadly speaking, was that awareness of the will was the first step towards freedom from its worst effects. You can't stop the wanting entirely, but you can stop mistaking every new want for an emergency. You can notice the pull without automatically following it, and that noticing is what creates space between you and the restless feeling that otherwise runs your entire life. So that space is really where peace actually lives, not in the absence of desire, but in the awareness of it. Subtle but important distinction. And developing this awareness is honestly a lifelong practice, but even a small increase in your ability to notice the will doing its thing without automatically reacting to it tends to reduce your stress level noticeably. It also tends to generate a lot of compassion for yourself and other people, because once you see that everyone is dealing with the same restless force, the pressure to have it all figured out starts to loosen considerably. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche, on the other hand, who came after Schopenhauer and was deeply influenced by him, looked at the same situation and came to a fundamentally different conclusion. Where Schopenhauer said the will is suffering and the best you can do is learn to detach from it, Nietzsche said something much bolder. He said the point isn't to escape the weight, the point is to become the kind of person who can actually carry it. Self-overcoming, that was his thing. Not running from difficulty, not transcending it through detachment, but growing larger than it through the act of facing it directly and deliberately. And this is where the concept of amor fati comes in, the love of fate, the practice of not just accepting what happens to you, but actually embracing it as necessary, as the exact material you needed in order to become who you're capable of becoming. And as Nietzsche put it in Twilight of the Idols, what does not kill me makes me stronger. And when you apply that to stress, the entire dynamic changes, right? Stress will no longer be something you're trying to get rid of. You will start treating it as raw material, the resistance that makes the muscle grow. Because without it, there's nothing to push against and therefore no growth. So think about the people you most admire, the ones who seem genuinely grounded and capable and unshakable. None of them got that way by having an easy life. They got that way by facing hard things repeatedly and not breaking. And every round of difficulty added another layer of resilience that you can see in how they carry themselves. And Nietzsche wasn't saying you should seek out suffering for its own sake or that there's something noble about being miserable. He's saying that when stress and difficulty and challenge inevitably arrive, and they always do, the choice is between shrinking from it or using it as fuel for becoming more. And that choice, made repeatedly over time, is what separates people who grow from people who just survive. And this is an important distinction from passive acceptance. Nietzsche wasn't a passive thinker. He didn't believe in lying down and taking it. Overcoming means actively engaging with the thing that's challenging you, going towards it with full force, using your will not to escape the difficulty, but to transform it and transform yourself in the process. So while Schopenhauer gives you the awareness and space, Nietzsche gives you direction and fire. And both are useful. Awareness, so you're not blindly reactive. Fire, so you're not passively dormant. Now, the person who integrates both, who can see the will for what it is, and also choose to engage with life's challenges as opportunities for growth, is probably the strongest possible position when it comes to dealing with stress or anything else for that matter. Now, Billie Jean King said it succinctly: pressure is a privilege. Most people hear that and think it's just a nicer way to say toughen up, but the real depth of it goes further than that. Here's the thing, you only feel pressure when the stakes are genuinely real, right? And the stakes are only real when you've earned or created a position where your performance actually matters. If nothing is on the line, there is no pressure. It's not possible. Pressure requires that something meaningful depends on what you do next, which means the very presence of pressure is proof that you're in the arena, that you're doing something that matters. So when you feel that weight before a big presentation, or that tightness in your chest before a difficult conversation, or that knot in your stomach before launching something new, that feeling isn't evidence that you're in danger. It's evidence that you're in a position where things matter, and that's not something most people should take for granted. The shift from seeing pressure as a threat to seeing pressure as proof of your position is one of the fastest ways to change your emotional state in a high-stakes moment. And it doesn't really require lying to yourself or pretending the pressure isn't there. It just requires seeing it accurately for what it is. And there's even something close to gratitude that can emerge from this perspective. Because the alternative to pressure, what is it? It's irrelevance or even boredom from not doing anything meaningful. And very few people who've tasted both pressure and irrelevance would voluntarily go back to the latter. So the key distinction that makes this useful is that it separates the feeling of pressure from the story about what the feeling means. The feeling is just activation, your nervous system getting ready for something that matters. The story is usually something along the lines of you're going to fail, everyone will see you mess up, you're not ready, you're in over your head. And once again, it's the story that creates the suffering, not the feeling itself. Elite performers across every field, athletes, musicians, surgeons, entrepreneurs, tend to have a different relationship with pressure than everyone else, and it's not that they feel less of it. They often feel more. The difference is that they've learned to interpret the feeling as readiness. And the good news is that this interpretation is learnable. It can be yours. At the end of the day, it comes down to perception, and perception can be changed. It's a perspective you practice, and the starting point is just recognizing that pressure only shows up when you've put yourself in a position that is worth being in. So pulling all three of these together, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the pressure is a privilege idea, gives you a philosophical framework for stress. Schopenhauer shows you that restlessness and wanting are the default human condition, and that seeing them clearly is the beginning of freedom. Nietzsche shows you that the difficulty you face isn't just to be endured, but to be used as material for becoming more. And the privilege frame shows you that the weight you feel is often evidence of a life worth living rather than evidence that something has gone wrong. Now, these three perspectives build on each other. Awareness first, then engagement, then gratitude for the opportunity to engage. And when you hold all three of them together, stress starts to feel like a companion that shows up whenever you're doing something that actually matters. These are ideas from some of the deepest thinkers in human history who wrestled seriously with the question of suffering and came out the other side with something genuinely useful. So take this into your next stressful moment and ask yourself what each one of these perspectives would say about what you're experiencing right now. And if nothing else, just knowing that thinkers far smarter than any of us struggled with the exact same internal experiences and found real ways through them is really grounding. You're not the first person to feel this, and the fact that it's been examined this thoroughly for this long should tell you something about both how universal it is, but also how workable it tends to be once you engage with it. So with all of that in the background, let's turn to the most practical section of this whole training, the actual path through stress and out the other side. So let's talk about the path that runs straight through. So we've dismantled the illusion, we've mapped the machinery, and we've pulled in some of the deepest philosophical thinking on suffering and striving. Now it's time to talk about what you actually do when stress shows up. And the answer might surprise you, because it goes against basically everything you might know. You don't manage it, you don't cope with it, you don't breathe through it and hope it passes, you walk straight into it. There's a principle that shows up across traditions and disciplines from psychotherapy to martial arts to spiritual practice, and it goes like this. What you resist persists. The more energy you put into fighting a feeling, the more that feeling anchors itself into your experience and refuses to leave. It's counterintuitive because everything in our conditioning tells us that the way to deal with something unpleasant is to push it away, distract from it, overpower it somehow. But feelings don't work like that, especially stress. So the moment you declare war on it, you give it a permanent place in your attention. It lives in your head rent-free, in other words. So there's a real paradox here that tends to trip people up at first. Fighting stress is one of the most stress-producing activities there is. You're tense about being tense, anxious about your anxiety, stressed about how stressed you are, and each layer of resistance adds another layer until you can't even remember what the original stressor was, because now the dominant experience is just resistance all the way down. So the amount of energy people burn fighting their own internal states is genuinely staggering. Energy that could be going into creative work, relationships, building something meaningful, problem solving. Instead, it's all being funneled into an internal battle that by design can never be won through force. And this is why so many people feel exhausted without having done anything particularly demanding with their day. They haven't been productive tired. They've been resistance tired, which is a completely different kind of fatigue and one that rest alone doesn't tend to fix. Now, the alternative, and it sounds almost too simple to be real, is to stop resisting. Which doesn't mean to passively lie down and accept a bad situation. That's not what this is about. It's to stop fighting the feeling of stress and instead redirect the energy towards engaging directly with whatever the feeling is pointing at. So you feel stressed about a conversation you need to have. Stop managing the anxiety and go have the conversation. You feel stressed about a financial situation. Stop distracting yourself and actually look at the numbers. You feel stressed about a decision. Stop waiting around and actually commit to something, whatever it is. Make a choice, make a decision. The way through stress is almost always through the thing causing the stress, not around it, not over it, not under it, directly through it. And the moment you move toward it instead of away from it, the stress begins to lose its foundation because the stress is almost always coming from the avoidance of the situation, not the situation itself. You've had the capacity all along. The only thing that was missing was the willingness to face it head on rather than sideways. And this brings us to a more active version of the same idea. Don't just stop resisting, but actually lean in. Force yourself on the thing that's causing you stress with full deliberate engagement. It will stop feeling as powerful once you're moving through it. Most stressful situations lose a significant portion of their intensity the moment you engage with them directly and with full focus. The stress lives in the gap between awareness and action. It lives in the maybe I will and the I should probably and the I'll deal with this later space. Close that gap and the stress has nowhere to exist. So the relief is often immediate. You know the feeling. You finally do something you've been putting off And the first thought is always the same. Why didn't I just do this sooner? And the answer is that your mind made it seem bigger than it actually was, and you believed the projection instead of engaging with reality. And every time you lean in and discover that the thing was more manageable than your mind suggested and weaker than your own will, you build a new pattern. The gap between awareness and action becomes a little smaller, and eventually, for many people, it becomes almost reflexive to move toward discomfort and get the priceless feeling of winning than to ignore it. Now, I'm not saying you should pretend to feel fearless or pretend you don't feel nervous or uncomfortable. The feeling is fine and normal. The idea is to not let the feeling dictate your own behavior. You feel the stress and you move anyway. You feel the discomfort and you engage anyway. It will eventually become the strongest version of yourself, acting in spite of the feeling rather than waiting for the feeling to pass. And at some point, you'll actually learn to love that feeling. Real courage, the kind that actually changes your life, isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more than the fear. Courage can't be the absence of fear. Courage literally means to overcome fear. So if there is no fear, there is no courage. And what you do repeatedly becomes who you are, and the person who consistently moves towards difficulty rather than away from it develops a relationship with stress that most people can't even imagine. Now, speaking of identity, this is one of the sneakiest things about chronic stress that almost nobody talks about. Some people, and this might be uncomfortable to hear, are genuinely attached to being stressed. It's become part of how they see themselves. Stress is their proof of importance, their evidence of a big life, their badge of busyness that signals to the world and to themselves that they matter and that their time is valuable and that they are serious people doing serious things. They've attached stress to their sense of worth as people. So think about how often people lead with how stressed they are in casual conversations. How are you, you ask? And they respond with, oh my God, so busy, so stressed, it's been insane. And there's almost a competitive element to it in certain circles where the more overwhelmed you are, the more important you seem. And all of that, consciously or not, creates an incentive to stay stressed because the stress is performing a social/psychological function that has nothing to do with the actual demands of your life. Stress, as a status signal, is so deeply embedded in certain professional and other cultures that people feel genuinely uncomfortable when they're not stressed, as if something must be wrong, as if they're not doing enough, as if calm equals lazy or irrelevant. This is the exact same dynamic that plays out with any deeply ingrained habit. Part of a person's identity gets wrapped up in the pattern itself. The routines, the familiar discomfort, the way it shapes your day and your social interactions. Letting go of the habit literally means letting go of a piece of who you thought you were, and that's scary even when the thing you're letting go of is clearly hurting you. So what you need to do is really to just ask yourself whether your stress is actually about your circumstances or whether it's performing a function in your identity. Are you stressed because your life demands it, or are you stressed because on some level you've decided that stress is what you are supposed to feel? And if it's the second one, which for many people it tends to be at least partially, then no amount of life optimization will fix it because you'll just find new things to be stressed about to maintain the identity. And this is probably the most confronting idea in this whole training because it asks you to take responsibility for something you've probably been blaming on external factors your entire adult life. But it's also maybe the most liberating because the moment you untangle your identity from your stress level, you give yourself permission to exist without the constant fake busyness. So, ask yourself, if tomorrow morning all of your stress disappeared completely, would you know who you are without it? And now, the heart of everything we've been building throughout this training. Most real stress, meaning the stress that comes from actual events and actual circumstances that you need to deal with, is surprisingly manageable for most people. It just is. You get the news, you feel it, you deal with it, you move forward. That process, painful as it might be in the moment, painful as it might be sometimes, tends to resolve itself with reasonable speed once you actually engage with reality. What isn't manageable, what makes people feel genuinely stuck and overwhelmed and like they can't breathe, is the thinking about the stress. The layer upon layer of story and narrative and projection and catastrophizing and self-judgment that gets piled on top of what was originally a fairly straightforward problem. So if you really think about it, it's a distraction. Stress is a distraction. The overthinking isn't working on the problem at all. It's a way to avoid the problem while feeling like you're doing something. Your mind stays busy so it feels like you're doing something, but nothing actually changes in the real world. Instead of facing the discomfort, you stay in analysis because it temporarily reduces the fear of action, even though it increases long-term stress. So thinking about all the possible scenarios gives you the sensation of control. If I think enough, I'll prevent the bad outcome. It drains your attention and your confidence, and it delays the only thing that reliably lowers stress: direct engagement with the thing in front of you, engagement with the real world, with reality as it is. Like we talked about earlier with the second arrow, the stress itself is the first arrow, right? You're thinking about the stress is the second, third, fourth, and 47th arrow. And by the time you finish thinking about it, the original stressor has been magnified to a degree that bears almost no resemblance to the actual situation you're facing. You started with a problem and ended with a crisis, and the only thing that changed between those two was the amount of mental activity you layered on top. So you need to learn to recognize when you've moved from dealing with an actual problem to dealing with your own thinking about the problem. Not because thinking is bad, thinking is obviously necessary, but controlled repetitive thinking that generates emotion without generating solutions is not useful to anyone. A good rule of thumb is, if you've been thinking about the same thing for more than a few minutes without arriving at a new insight or a concrete next step, you're not problem solving anymore. You're just looping, and the loop itself is the stress. So the stress is almost never the thing, it's always the resistance to the thing. That's why I said stress is a distraction. The thinking about the thing, the avoidance of the thing, the identity wrapped around the thing, strip all of that away, and what you're left with is usually just a thing. A situation, a task, a conversation, a number, something concrete and finite that you can engage with directly and deal with and then move on from. The most effective way to break any cycle isn't necessarily to find better coping strategies for the discomfort. It's to understand that the discomfort was manufactured by a pattern you thought was protecting you, and once you see that, it's over. Most of what you're feeling isn't the weight of your life, it's the weight of your thinking about your life. And that's an invitation to experiment with the possibility that you've been making this harder than it needs to be for yourself. Most people have, and the moment you stop making it hard, well, it tends to stop being hard. So the illusion is that stress is an accurate report on the difficulty of your circumstances. The reality is that stress is mostly a byproduct of how your mind is processing those circumstances. Indecision, conflicting desires, open loops, resistance, identity attachment, overthinking, and looping. These are the actual generators, and every single one of them is something you have influence over once you actually see them. So the path forward is simple, even though it's not always easy. Decide, commit, close your loops, stop resisting the feeling and start engaging with what's behind it, and question whether your stress is serving a function in your actual identity. And above all, learn to catch the moment when you've moved from dealing with a real situation to running in circles in your own mental stories about it. Now, keep in mind, this is a practice. Some days you'll catch it instantly and the stress will dissolve immediately. Other days it will take you an hour or a week to realize you've been looping. Both are fine, the direction matters more than the speed. The direction is always the same, towards the thing, not away from it. Through the discomfort, not around it. Into the reality of the situation, rather than into the fantasy about what the situation might become. Engage with reality. Stress for most people and in most situations feels essential. It feels like it's keeping you safe, keeping you alert, keeping you responsible, but when you actually examine it honestly, Most of it is just mental noise that's costing you far more than it's actually giving you. And seeing that is the way through. Not fighting, not managing or coping or distracting, just seeing without the layers. That's all it tends to take for a lot of this to just change. And if you're still skeptical, that's perfectly fine. Skepticism is healthy, and honestly, I welcome it. If you weren't skeptical, I would find it weird. All I'd suggest is that you try it once. Pick the thing you've been most stressed about this week, engage with it directly, and notice what happens to the feeling the moment you move towards it. That experience will tell you everything you need to know. So with that said, let's cover the review. We talked about the overview, the illusion nobody talks about, the machinery behind mental paralysis, the wisdom of weight and will, the path that runs straight through, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. First, pick the one thing you've been putting off, the decision, the conversation, the task that's been sitting in the back of your mind, generating low-grade tension for days or weeks, and commit to doing it within the next 24 hours without negotiating yourself about the timing. Then sit down and list every open loop you're currently carrying, every unanswered message, unfinished task, half-made plan, and vague commitment, and close each one by completing it, scheduling it, or dropping it entirely. And the next time you feel stressed, pause long enough to ask yourself whether you're reacting to an actual situation or to a story you built on top of the situation, and see what happens when you engage with the situation directly with actual reality instead of wrestling with the story. With that said, if you want to work with me one-on-one, as I said in the beginning, on improving every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, make sure to book a call from the link in the description or the pinned comment. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful. And thank you for the support. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.